Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak to you. And thank you, Peter, for the lovely introduction. Yes, I was in London last week, so I'm a little bit jet-lagged, but it was great to get back on the road and go and see a whole bunch of clients. And likewise, it's really, really good to be back in the room. A couple of years ago, we were doing most of this via VC and via Zoom, so being able to get out and to do these things in person in the room has a real quality to it. Now, I've been given the formidable task, actually, of trying to summarise how the global economy's been travelling and the local economy and what's going to happen next in just the next 20 minutes, which is I'm going to get straight to rather than try and dwell on my introductory remarks. And after that, Josephine's going to get up and speak, and then we're going to be able to take a few questions. So save your burning questions until the question session afterwards. It has been a challenging time for the global economy, not to say the least. The other thing I think that's most particular that I say at the beginning of these presentations at the moment is if you don't fully make sense of exactly how it all fits together and why, you shouldn't feel bad, because it has been extraordinarily complicated, I think, what's been going on in terms of the global and the local economic story. So I feel that it is one of my jobs, at least, to try to help you understand by giving you not just forecasts, but also explaining the frameworks I use for thinking about what's been going on. So I'm going to start with the primary challenge that the global economy faces right now, and it's also the challenge that we face at the moment here in Australia, and that is that inflation has picked up in ways that we haven't seen in multiple decades. Inflation is still running at rates that is well above central banks' targets in the US, in Europe, in the UK, in New Zealand here as well. And this has been the main challenge that policymakers face both locally and across the world. And it's one we haven't had in this sort of form and this sort of scale in multiple decades. We've been looking at inflation rates that have been running at levels that we haven't seen since the early 1980s in some locations. In Europe last year, inflation got to be double digit, so it was running at over 10%. Here, inflation is still running at 7%, although it's come down a little bit from its peaks. And in the US, inflation got up to a peak of 9%. It's back down to 5%. But that's still extremely high, and higher than central banks are prepared to tolerate. Most central banks around the world target much lower rates of inflation. The US Federal Reserve targets a 2% rate, and so does the European Central Bank and the British. We target 2 to 3% here in Australia. And this has been the challenge. That inflation has been too high, and it still remains that. And that's one that is very difficult for policymakers as well, and I want to explain why. So how did we get such high inflation rates? As I say, here in Australia, it peaked at 7.8% in the tail end of last year. It's now running at 7%. In the US, it peaked at 9%, and now it's running at 5%. And in Europe, it peaked at 11% almost, and it's running closer to 7%. How did we get such high rates of inflation? Well, part of it reflects some structural features. There are things going on in the global economy that have been going on for a while that are changing the way it operates. Things like geopolitical challenges with managing China and the relationship with the rest of the world. Things like ageing populations, a demographic. As the population ages, you have less workers in the global system. And then other issues like the energy transition that we're making because of climate change. And these things all have an influence. But the primary influence as to why inflation has been high recently has no doubt been the pandemic and its effects. So not just the effect of the pandemic itself, but the policy responses that were delivered in response to the pandemic. And the way to frame this, or at least the way I would explain this to you so that you can frame it, is what's been happening recently is demand in the economy. So if you think about demand in the economy is how much consumers spend, how much businesses invest, how much governments spend, demand has been running well ahead of the capacity of the economy to supply. Right? The capacity of the economy to deliver. The supply side is the ability of the economy to match that demand, to be able to deliver. And what did the pandemic deliver? Well, the pandemic, at least initially, delivered a big fall in both of those things. Right? Demand fell in the first half of 2020 because, well, consumers got nervous and couldn't spend. We were told we couldn't do a whole bunch of things. Businesses got nervous because there was a pandemic going on. They hadn't seen one of that scale in 100 years, and so demand weakened. But the supply side of the economy also got heavily constrained. We all adjusted our business models. We had to work from home, we had to put in place new protocols. We had to take it more seriously that we didn't have contact with people. That was a big supply constraint. So initially, in the face of the pandemic, we saw this big fall in demand and fall in supply. But it didn't take long, only the middle of 2020, from that point forward, where demand started to recover and supply was still heavily constrained in the global economy. Why did demand start to recover? Well, we started to get used to how to manage the pandemic. We started to reopen our economies. But there was another force at work, and that was governments gave massive amounts of stimulus to the economy. Central banks cut interest rates to zero. They launched asset purchase programs. They bought private sector assets at one point in time, some of the central banks. Really, really large monetary stimulus. And then the other factor, of course, was that the governments around the world went out on an enormous spending spree. They delivered more spending than we've seen at any time outside of wartime. The pandemic was treated like a conflict in some ways. And so the US delivered $3.5 trillion, 25% of GDP worth of fiscal spending, mostly transfers directly to the households in their economy. In Europe, similar scaled programs, a little bit smaller, but essentially large-scale fiscal support. And here, the government spent $350 billion, or 15% worth of GDP, in these fiscal transfers. So if I go back to where I was, we're getting this recovery in demand from the middle of 2020 onwards that's pump primed by very low interest rates, massive fiscal spending, lots of transfers to households, and we're facing an economy that is heavily supply constrained still. We're still managing protocols from the virus back then. Shipping had been heavily disrupted, so the cost of shipping had gone up substantially. Supply chains in the manufacturing industry were heavily disrupted. We weren't producing enough semiconductors, so we didn't have enough manufactured goods. And if you're in construction, a lot of people are in this room, I know, that everything was disrupted for quite a considerable period of time. Materials, labour, and in Australia's case, of course, we shut the border as well for 2 years, which constrained the availability of that labour. And so where did that land us? Well, demand picked up from the middle of 2020 onwards, and supply was constrained, so eventually it started to put upward pressure on prices, and it showed up first in places like the US, where inflation really started to get going from the early part of 2021 onwards. In Europe, it was a little bit later. Here, it was a little bit later still. It didn't arrive until the tail end of 2021. And the initial response from central banks that have these interest rate settings that they use to try to manage inflation was, oh, that'll be okay because it's mostly those supply disruptions. And when they wear off, inflation will come back down. And there was certainly some truth to this. But the thing is, it took until about now for a lot of these supply disruptions to start to wear off. Shipping costs are now fallen, manufactured goods supply is freeing up, materials costs are starting to come down a bit, free flow of labour is starting to remedy itself to a degree. Some of them are still with us. But the thing that happened in the interim was demand picked up strongly because households went out and spent a lot of that money that they were given, a lot of the support they were given through the pandemic. They couldn't spend it at the time. They're now spending it to support growth. And so this has been pump priming inflation as well. Central banks had to completely change their tune, and they did, from around the tail end of 2021. And of course, famously here in Australia, the RBA got this massive upside surprise in inflation early last year and had to start lifting interest rates. And having not seen the pickup in inflation coming, they've had to jam the brakes on. And that brings us to where we are now, which is central banks around the world have been really doing pretty much the same thing. They've all been lifting interest rates substantially, sharply, rapidly, with one intention, that is to try to get inflation back to target. But the problem is this, right? That when you think about it a little harder, they can't fix the supply side. They can't fix all of the supply side constraints in the economy. That's beyond the capability of monetary policy. What they can do, though, is they can slow down demand, and that's the main thing they're trying to do. So if you translate what I just said into simple terms, you say, well, they're lifting interest rates really a lot at the moment, substantially and rapidly, with the intention of slowing down demand, i.e. slowing down growth in the economy, slowing down the consumer and encouraging them not to spend as much, slowing down businesses in terms of their investment intentionally to try to get inflation back to where it needs to be, because they can't fix the supply side of the economy. Some of those things will fix themselves gradually, but primarily it's about slowing down demand. So if you land where we are right now, that's what they've been doing. You know, the Federal Reserve in the US has lifted its interest rates by 4.75 percentage points, 475 basis points so far. The RBNZ across the Tasman has done 525 basis points. The ECB, the European Central Bank, has gone by 375, and we've done the same. The RBA has gone by 375. In 12 months, they've lifted their policy rate with the intention of slowing the economy down. How much success are they having in doing that? Because that's the objective, remember. The objective is to deliver a downturn and try to get inflation down. Well, they're having some success. Inflation has already peaked. As I say, it peaked at 7.8% here. It's now at 7%. It's coming down. In the US, it's peaked as well. In Europe, it's peaked too. But it's still early days. I don't think they can be completely convinced that they've actually slowed things enough to get inflation to come back down to where it needs to be. I think the RBA might be convinced that it doesn't have to do too much more in terms of lifting interest rates, but it also means we shouldn't expect there will be interest rate cuts anytime soon. So where does that land us for Australia and how we're positioned in all of this? Well, as I say, the policy rate's been lifted quickly. The Australian economy is slowing down. The consumer is starting to slow down. Consumer sentiment is very weak. It's at recessionary levels. It's been there for a number of months now. Retail sales fell outright in the first quarter of this year, so consumers are starting to pull back in their overall spend. And as you'd all be fairly well aware, the housing market, at least, in response to the rise in interest rates, well, it had been declining, right? House prices rose by 25% through the pandemic. They've fallen by 10% from their peak, and that was a response to the interest rate rises that have happened. Inflation starting to come down, and that's a helpful feature. Australia might be slightly better placed than a lot of other places, because one of the primary problems that other countries have got is that they've had high inflation. It's fed through because the labour market's been tight to very, very strong wages growth. Strong wages growth then makes it harder to get inflation to come back down, because in order to do that, you've actually got to get the unemployment rate to rise. People have got to start losing their jobs. The labour market needs to loosen up. Here in Australia, we have had a pickup in wages growth, but so far it hasn't been quite as excessive as we've seen elsewhere. This may be a feature that allows us to have a slowdown that's sufficient to get inflation down without needing to have a really large rise in the unemployment rate. That's one positive we should think about. Another positive for Australia is we've reopened our border. And to me, at least, one of the primary things that's been a constraint on our economy to be able to grow and why we've had high inflation has been not just that demand has picked up, but for a while there, we weren't able to get any workers, right? We weren't able to get the workers that come from offshore. We've now reopened the border, and as you may or may not know, population growth is picking up very strongly. Inward migration has taken off. And that's starting to provide a few more workers, and we're seeing some freeing up in the skill shortages that you might have faced in parts of the economy. I think that's going to be quite helpful for Australia in terms of freeing up the supply side while demand slows down. It also means another thing, and that is, although I think the Australian economy is going to slow down, and we've got growth slowing from about 4% last year, it was very strong last year, primed by the consumer that was spending a lot. We hadn't been able to do a bunch of things, so we were out spending that income that we'd saved. Well, that consumer is now slowing down, as I've described, but it's very hard to get an economy to go outright backwards, to turn into recession, if you've got population growth that's holding up really well. And it is. Population growth has gone from close to flat last year to now running at about 2%. Over the past, in this financial year alone, we're taking in about 400,000 extra people into the economy. That's good for supporting growth. It's good for driving labour supply. But, and here's where I'm going to sort of land and sort of fashion a final few remarks, it also presents some challenges, for example, in the housing industry, in the housing construction story, because although, of course, it's great that we're getting a lot more people coming through and it's supporting growth, it's also tightening up what is a very tight rental market in Australia. And you're seeing this being described in lots of dimensions at the moment. The rental market is very tight, rents are rising quickly, and that's a challenge. At the moment, of course, with interest rates having gone up really strongly or really substantially, and house prices having been falling recently, it's been harder to actually motivate much housing construction, new housing construction or new approvals, because those tend to weaken. And so we are faced with a housing challenge, a very tight housing market, rents that are rising, and that's going to contribute more to inflation. However, I think the primary offset, at least from an inflation perspective, is we're also getting all those workers start to flow through, and that's going to mean that other areas don't see the same sort of wage pressures. For the housing market in general, my view is house prices are unlikely, I think, to fall further. They're lifting, but it's not so much like previous cycles where it's been about interest rates coming down. And in fact, I don't think interest rates are coming down anytime soon. I've basically got the RBA on hold over the coming quarters, if not lifting a little bit further, but essentially on hold. But the main thing that's been lifting or supporting the housing market has been very strong population growth. When you get a very large influx of people, they need somewhere to live, and that's supporting demand for housing. It's supporting the established market, but it's also keeping the rental market quite tight. So to wrap up, again, 20 minutes is hard to fill it all together, but the global economy faces a pretty big challenge. Inflation is still really quite high. Central banks around the world have had to lift interest rates substantially, and the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, probably lifts rates further. We think the Europeans do too, and probably the Bank of England as well. And they need to slow their economies down quite a lot in order to get both inflation and wages down. So the world looks as though it's going into a downswing. It's begun already, but it probably has to slow down even more yet before it can start to stabilise, because inflation needs to come down. We are a little bit better placed, partly because we haven't yet had a really big pickup in wages growth. It hasn't sort of exploded into a wage price spiral. We're a little bit better off because we've got this reopened border that's delivering a lot more labour supply now and starting to free things up. But we still have challenges of our own. The RBA still needs to keep its pressure on the economy. It needs to slow the economy down. We think growth slows from about 4% last year to about 1.5% this year, about the same next year. The primary thing that slows growth down is the consumer. We've got the consumer already slowing. We think that they're pulling back to a degree. And we do have this particular challenge in terms of how we manage the housing story, how we bring enough supply on stream in order to meet the ongoing demand that's going to come from population growth. But a final sort of bit of point to make that's a bit more positive is we're much, much better off having a population growth story that's positive, that's driving the economy, creating more opportunities at some point to build more capacity, that is housing and infrastructure, than being without those things. It's much better that way around than having an economy that might otherwise tip into a bigger downturn because we haven't got the population growth engine. Now, conscious that I have spoken, I filled the 20 minutes that I was given, and I've covered a lot of territory, and I hope that it's useful as a framework for thinking about things. Store up those questions for a bit later. I think Josephine's going to come up, or be introduced and then speak, and then we'll have a chance you can fire those complicated questions at me a little bit later. But thank you.